Hello. Welcome back to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin, and last week we talked about something that runs deep for so many of us. Aquí no se pide perdón. We don't apologize here. We talked about how we were taught almost without words to apologize for existing, to say I'm sorry for speaking too loud, for feeling too much, for taking up too much space, or for not fitting into molds that were never meant for us in the beginning. And since then, I've been thinking about what happens when we decide to stop apologizing, when we lift our heads again, when we release the guilt that was never ours to carry in the first place, when we finally say, yes, this is me, whole, intense, imperfect, but mine. Because when we stop apologizing, something inside of us awakens. That trembling voice begins to sound different, and is no longer a whisper asking for permission. It becomes steady, grounded, powerful. A voice that's done hiding, a voice that demands to be heard. And that's what I want to talk about today. What happens when our voice stops being a whisper and becomes a scream? Because there are screams that free us, screams that heal, screams that make people uncomfortable, and screams that some people simply don't want to hear. But we scream anyway, because our screams don't come from hate. They come from love, from self-love, from truth, from the deep aching need to exist fully. And we scream because silence became too heavy to carry, because keeping it all inside stopped being an option, because the body remembers and sometimes it speaks in screams. So today's episode is called I Am the Scream They Don't Want to Hear. Soy el grito que no quieren oír. And no, I don't say it with arrogance, I say it with truth. Because being the scream they don't want to hear means living with your soul wide awake, in a world that prefers you quiet, small, and obedient. But here we are, awake, present, loud, and unstoppable. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or your cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. And from a very young age, many of us learned that silence was a form of protection. We were told that speaking too much was dangerous, that raising our voice was disrespectful, that questioning was rebellious, and that the rebellion was something that needed to be corrected. And so little by little, we learned to swallow our words, to smile when we wanted to scream, to say it's nothing when our hearts were breaking into 1,000 pieces. And I too grew up hearing this. And for a very long time, I believed it. I believed that to be loved, I had to be quiet, that to be respected, I had to be obedient, and that to survive, I had to become invisible. But the body always remembers what the soul kept silent. And there comes a moment when that silence weighs heavier than any unspoken word. A moment when the body begins to scream, even if you don't say a single word. And I remember that I met a survivor who really left a mark on me. She was barely 18, and when she walked into my office, her shoulders were slumped, her hands were shaking, and her gaze was fixed on the floor. And I remember that I asked her name, and she just looked at me. With eyes full of fear, she was tired, and she said something that I still feel in my chest every time I share this story. I don't remember who I am. And I thought, how many of us have felt that at some point? And not because we don't have a name, but because the pain erases it, because trauma disconnects us from ourselves, because so much silence takes away our voice and with it our identity. And I worked with her for a few months, and at first she didn't speak much. Sometimes she would come in, sit across from me, and we would just sit in silence for minutes. But that silence wasn't empty. It was a space of trust, of healing, of reconstruction. I silenced that said, I have no words, but I need you to stay. Until one day, without warning, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, I don't want to be afraid anymore, but I don't know how to stop being afraid. And that day, I remember she started to cry. And she cried not out of sadness, but recognition. Because fear isn't conquered all at once. It doesn't vanish with a motivational quote or a promise of strength. Fear is disarmed little by little with love, with patience, with presence, and with truth, and sometimes also with a scream. Not a scream of rage, but a scream of life, a scream that says, I'm here, I'm still here, and I still have a voice. And that day I understood that sometimes healing isn't about becoming who you were before, but remembering who you always were, even when the world tried to make you forget. And that every word, every tear, and every breath is a way of telling life, you didn't erase me. And I too have had to scream to remind myself of that. I've had to raise my voice in meetings where no one wanted to hear me, at tables where I was the only young woman, the only Mexican, the only one saying what others preferred to ignore. And yeah, it's been painful, I won't lie, because every time a woman raises her voice in a space of power, there's always eyes trying to shut her down. But there are also girls, boys, young people, survivors listening, thinking, if she can speak, I can too. And that changes everything. And there's a phrase that has stayed with me for years: the voice that breaks the silence and refuses to be silenced. It's not just a pretty phrase, it's the way of life. Because when you work with pain, with trauma, and injustice, you understand that speaking is not just an action, it's resistance, it's self-love, it's justice in motion. And sometimes people ask me, don't you get tired, Jessica? And yes, I get tired, and a lot. And there are days I come home and I sit in my car for a few minutes before going in, just to let go of everything I heard that day. But then I remember why I started. I remember that little girl who swallowed her words. I remember my parents working tirelessly so I could have a voice. And I remember all the survivors who looked me in the eyes and said, thank you for speaking. And then I don't get tired anymore. I see the purpose. And silence may seem like peace, but sometimes it's just fear with another name. And some silences kill more than any scream. So if you're listening today, I want you to repeat this to yourself. You were not born to stay quiet. You were not born to fit in. You were not born to live in a cage disguised as a calm. And you were born to break chains with your voice. And sometimes I think silence wears many disguises. It disguises itself as respect, as being polite, as I don't want any trouble. It disguises itself as a forced smile in meetings, as I'm fine when inside you're shaking. But I've also learned that silence isn't always being coward. Sometimes it's a strategy. It's a way to observe, to survive, to wait for the exact right moment to speak. Because when that moment comes, when you finally decide to break it, raising your voice becomes an act of war. But I didn't always speak like this. I didn't always have this strong, confident, clear voice. I found it through hits, and not physical, but emotional. I found it in every door that closed when I asked for help, and every look that made me feel small, and every comment that tried to convince me that my light was too much. And there was a time when I believed that I wasn't enough, that I was too young, too emotional, too intense, too something. Until one day I realized something that changed everything. It wasn't that my voice was too loud. It was that their comfort was too fragile. In my work, I've sat at many tables where everyone talks about justice. Big words, beautiful words, right? But few are willing to get uncomfortable to actually reach it. And I've heard speeches full of equity, inclusion, diversity. And I watched them hang in the air, never touching the reality of the people who really need it the most. And it's there, right there, when my voice becomes uncomfortable, when I ask, where are the voices of survivors? Why do we keep talking about change if we're not willing to change? And yes, I've seen the looks, the mixture of discomfort, surprise, being defensive. But I no longer apologize for it, because I've learned that making people uncomfortable isn't being difficult, it's being brave. But I won't lie. There are days when that bravery hurts. It hurts to be the only voice saying what everyone else thinks but no one dares to say. And it hurts to be the woman who has to prove her worth 3 times over just to be heard. And it hurts to be the Latina in spaces where gratitude is expected and not leadership. But every time I feel that weight, I take a deep breath and remember, I didn't get here by accident. I got here because there were those who dreamed of this voice before me. By my mom, who told me, speak, hija, even if your voice shakes. My dad, who crossed borders hoping his daughter would have a chance. And all the men and women who resisted in silence, who dreamed of the day when their pain would become words. I am the echo of their dreams. I am the scream that comes from generations who couldn't scream. And I am proof that silence can be transformed into power. And now that I have this voice, the one that I earned through wounds, tears, and courage, I will not be silent. I just can't. Because every time I speak, all the voices the world tried to erase are speaking with me. And I remember one particular meeting, it was about policies to protect immigrants, and the table was full of people with power, prosecutors, directors, politicians, and yes, me, the young Latina social worker, the youngest in the room. And I remember there was one individual that said very firmly, what we need is efficiency, not emotions. And that just made me so upset. I was pissed off. I was angry. I was confused. I had all emotions mixed. And I just didn't know how someone could just say that. And I remember that I looked at him and replied, and it was very unplanned. And without fear, I just said this: emotions don't make us less professional. They make us human. And without humanity, no policy is effective. And there was a big silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. That kind of makes you doubt if you were too honest. But then I saw her. someone from the community sitting in the back, tears in her eyes, nodding. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just my voice. It was the voice of many families. And speaking from the heart is uncomfortable because it exposes truth. And there are people who prefer clean speeches without story, without pain, and without soul. But pain also has the right to exist because pain humanizes us. It connects us. And it reminds us that we are alive. And for a long time, I thought I had to choose between my career and my heart. That if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to harden myself, speak with a neutral voice, without emotion, without accent. And I believed it, and I forced it on myself. Until one day, after a long day, one of my clients hugged me and said, "Gracias por hablar como hablas, porque cuando te escucho siento que alguien como yo también puede sanar." Thank you for speaking the way that you speak, because when I hear you, I feel like someone like me can heal too. And in that moment, I understood that my accent, my emotion, and the way I speak were not weaknesses. They were power, my roots, and my story. And I'm 28 years old, and I've spent half of my life holding the stories of pain and determination. I've been in shelters, hospitals, police stations, offices, and streets where fear still echoes. And in every place, I've seen the same truth repeated. When a person begins to believe in their voice, the world begins to change little by little. So even when the noise is too loud, even when the discomfort hurts, even when exhaustion weighs heavy, I keep speaking because I know someone out there is listening, waiting for a sign that they are not alone, waiting for a word to remind them that their life matters. Being the scream they don't want to hear isn't a title, it's a burden, yes, a responsibility that hurts, but also a privilege because it means your voice is already shaking when it needs to fall, that you're moving structures simply by existing, simply by speaking. And if you, listening, feel like your voice doesn't matter, let me tell you this, your voice can save you and it can help someone else. And I don't know where you are in your story today. Maybe you're in silence. Maybe you're just learning to speak. Maybe you're screaming and no one seems to listen. But don't stop. Keep going. Your scream has an echo. And even if no one hears it yet, someone needs it. Because the uncomfortable screams are the ones that change history, the one that breaks cycles, the one that open up path for those who come after. And when your voice trembles, remember that trembling isn't a weakness. It's the ground shifting to make space for something new. And sometimes people ask me what it means to heal. And I always say, healing is not forgetting. Healing is remembering without it hurting the same way. It's being able to speak about what broke you without it stealing your voice. Healing is when the scream that once came out of anger now comes out of self-love, out of love for life, out of love for all those who come after. And I've seen many kinds of screams, the scream of fear, the scream of courage, the scream of lust. But the most powerful of all to me is the scream that is born when someone realizes they deserve to live in freedom. And I've stood with many survivors who after months of silence, one day say, "It wasn't my fault." And those 4 words sound like a roar, because behind all those people is a whole life deciding to start over. A heart that begins to believe again. A life refusing to be defined by pain. That too is a scream. A soft scream, but full of truth. A scream that doesn't need volume to have strength. And if you're listening to this and have felt that your voice doesn't matter, I want you to repeat after me. My voice matters. My story matters. My pain does not define me, and my scream is my freedom. Because yes, we are the scream they don't want to hear, but we're also the song that begins after silence. And over the years, I've learned that screaming doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes screaming is saying no. Sometimes it's asking for help. Sometimes it's crying without fear of judgment. Sometimes it's deciding that you deserve peace. And my scream has transformed over time. It stopped being only anger. Now it's purpose. Now it is community. Now it is love. And being a director, leading a program, coordinating strategies, yes, all of that matters. But what moves me most aren't the titles. It's when someone I helped years ago messages me and says things like, "Jessica, I did it. I have my own apartment," or "I'm studying," or "I'm no longer afraid. I'm at peace with myself." That is the true impact. That is where my scream finds meaning. Because my voice alone, without theirs, has never been enough. Never has. And being the scream they don't want to hear also means being the voice that accompanies others while they find their own. And that to me is the most rewarding part of the work that I do. And I don't want to be the only one screaming. I want all of us to scream together, to let our voices intersect, to be heard, and to support one another. So that when one falls, another lifts them. Because when a scream becomes collective, there's no way to silence it. And it's no longer about me, it's about us. And I think a lot about my roots, my mom, my dad, the little girl I was sitting at the table listening to conversations in Spanish and English, trying to understand who I was between two worlds. And I realized that that little girl already knew. She knew that one day she would use her voice for something bigger than herself. She knew that silence was not her destiny. And today I look back and say to her, thank you for not giving up. Thank you for continuing to speak even when your voice trembled. And thank you for screaming when no one else did. Today I know who I am. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I'm a woman. I'm a social worker. I'm a leader. And I'm a survivor of my own battles. And I am the scream they don't want to hear. Soy el grito que no quieren oír. And I'm also the hope that cannot be extinguished. The hope that survives the noise. That transforms pain into purpose. And keeps screaming. Not of anger, but out of love. And as always, I want to share a book called Speak, Habla by Lori Hales Anderson. And the book tells the story of a young girl who, after experiencing a traumatic event, retreats into silence, hiding her pain and her truth. And through her journey, we see how her fear, her shame, and societal pressure can silence our voices, making us feel invisible and isolated. But the story also shows that silence cannot last forever. Finding the courage to speak, to express what we feel and what moves us is an act of power and self-definition. This book connects deeply with today's episode of I'm the scream they don't want to hear, soy el grito que no quieren oír, because it reminds us that we've all had moments when we stayed quiet to protect ourselves or to please others. Regaining our voice is an act of resistance and freedom. Just as in today's episode where we talk about transforming the scream of anger into a scream of self-love. Speak Habla inspires us to recognize our pain, name it, and finally dare to tell our truth, even when it makes uncomfortable those who prefer to silence. So thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing me to share this episode with you. You know, sometimes I think that speaking isn't just speaking. Sometimes speaking is an act of courage that hurts, that breaks you, that shakes you. And that's why so many of us learn to stay quiet. We were told it wasn't safe, that it wasn't elegant, that it wasn't in our best interest, that our voice was too much, too loud, too dramatic, too uncomfortable. And here we are, still speaking, still screaming, still trying to be heard. And if you're listening to this and something inside you stirred, if you felt like crying or screaming, or you felt that lump in your throat that keeps you from speaking, that too is a scream. Your body is speaking to you. Even if you don't always hear it, it's telling you, I'm ready to heal, to speak my truth, to live differently. And I want you to listen to that because it's real and because it's powerful. So don't let anyone make you feel like your voice is too much. Don't let them silence you with their looks, their awkward silences, or their maybe it's better if you don't say that. Because the voices that changed the world were always called too much first. They were always uncomfortable, they always challenged, and they were always necessary. So scream in your own way. Scream it with the words that you've held back out of fear, shame, or not wanting to bother anyone. Scream with the memories that made you doubt yourself. Scream the story that no one ever heard you tell. Scream until your chest feels lighter. Scream until your pain turns into strength. Scream until you recognize yourself, until you feel free. Because when you dare to scream, you are not alone. Your voice opens a path for others to find theirs. When you break the silence, you create an echo that no one can silence. And when you speak, someone else dares to say, I exist too, and I deserve to be heard too. So today I tell you, thank you. Thank you for letting your scream meet mine. Thank you for letting your voice find its way. And never forget, your voice matters. Your story matters. Your truth matters. Never stop saying it, because your scream is not just yours. Your scream is freedom. Your scream is resistance. Your scream is love. So keep living, because your voice is bigger than you think, more powerful than you were ever told, and more necessary than you ever imagined. As always, in the description of this episode, you'll find the link to the book I mentioned today. And remember, every Friday there's a new episode. Today we talked about screams, voices that no one wants to hear, stories that dare to step out of silence. But next Friday we'll go even deeper. The episode will be called Cosas que no se dicen, the things we don't say. And we'll explore the words we've held inside, the truths we've been afraid to speak for years, family truths that hurt, traumas that marked us, emotions we hid to be accepted, to survive, to avoid discomfort. This episode is for those who learn to stay quiet, to protect themselves, for those who feel that their story doesn't matter, that their pain doesn't matter, and for those still searching for their voice. because these things that are left unsaid deserve to be heard. They deserve to be recognized, and they deserve to be freed. We'll talk about mental health, trauma, invisible wounds that still weigh heavy. We'll talk about what we were taught to hide, to ignore, to deny, and how finally we can face it, name it, speak it out loud, and most importantly, begin to heal. Because only when we speak out loud what we kept silent does true freedom begin. Get ready to hear what for too long no one dared to say. You've been listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.